My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the Kevin Michael Grace Show. Later in today's show, I will be discussing Blaise Pascal's Pensées. And I started yesterday's show with some literature, a short story by Edgar Allan Poe, The Masque of the Red Death. And I thought to link the beginning of the show with the end of the show, and also as a comment on our current situation, I would read a poem by Charles Baudelaire to the reader, which is the introductory poem of his Les Fleurs du Mal, The Flowers of Evil. I know the poetry in Roy Campbell's excellent translation. My French is poor, to put it mildly. Roy Campbell was a great poet, originally from South Africa. He was born in 1901 and he died in 1957. He is neglected because he was a right-winger and fell out hard with the Bloomsbury crowd. I suppose he's best known today not for his original poems, but for his translations from the French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin. He introduced his volume of the complete poems of Charles Baudelaire with this. These poems have been known for years, ever since they were first popularized by Swinburne as the flowers of evil, but flowers of sickness, flowers of anguish, or flowers of pain would better describe a great many of them than flowers of evil, since the word mal covers all these interpretations. Having had considerable success with my translation of a saint, St. John of the Cross, I determined to translate a fellow sinner who is hardly less a believer, even in his rebellious and blasphemous moments, than the saint himself. I've been reading Baudelaire since I was 15, carried him in my haversack through 2 wars, and have loved him longer and more deeply than any other poet. I translated St. John of the Cross because he miraculously saved my life in Toledo in 1936. I'm translating Baudelaire because he lived my life up to the same age, with similar sins, remorses, ostracisms, and poverty, and the same desperate hope of reconciliation and pardon. And I must say to him, as Manuel Barbosa du Bocage said to Louis de Camões, and though in shame and all precarious shifts you were my model, mine's the crowning sorrow to share your luck, but lack your towering gifts. He said, he concluded his introduction, if I have not made as good a translation of Baudelaire as in the case of San Juan, it will not be so much from lack of striving, but for want of supernatural aid for the latter. The case, he says that whenever he got stuck, the saint only needed to raise his stick and say, "Are burro, gee up donkey" to me, and the donkey trotted. So here is the introduction to the reader from Charles Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal. Folly and error, avarice and vice employ our souls and waste our bodies' force. As mangy beggars incubate their lice, we nourish our innocuous remorse. Our sins are stubborn, craven our repentance. For our weak vows we ask excessive prices. Trusting our tears will wash away the sentence, we sneak off where the muddy road entices. Cradled in evil, that thrice great magician, the devil, rocks our souls that can't resist, and the rich metal of our own volition is vaporized by that sage alchemist. The devil pulls the strings by which we're worked. By all revolting objects lured, we slink hellwards. Each day down one more step we're jerked, feeling no horror through the shades that stink. Just as a lustful pauper bites and kisses the scarred and shriveled breast of an old whore, we steal along the roadside furtive blisses, squeezing them like stale oranges for more. Packed tight like hives of maggots, thickly seething within our brains, a host of demons surges. Deep down into our lungs, at every breathing, death flows, an unseen river, moaning dirges. If rape or arson, poison or the knife has wove no pleasing patterns in the stuff of this drab canvas we accept as life, it is because we are not bold enough. Amongst the jackals, leopards, mongrels, apes, snakes, scorpions, vultures that with hellish din squeal, roar, writhe, gambol, crawl with monstrous shapes In each man's foul menagerie of sin, there's one more damned than all. He never gambles, nor crawls, nor roars, but from the rest withdrawn, gladly of this whole earth would make a shambles and swallow up existence with a yawn. Boredom. He smokes his hookah while he dreams of gibbets, weeping tears he cannot smother. You know this dainty monter too, it seems. Hypocrite reader, you, my twin, my brother. Appropriate, I think, for our present situation. It's been brought home to us that we are all going to die one day, and our reaction to it is, disbelief and terror. So I see in the New York Times that we have a new coronavirus monster, and his name is Jared Kushner, who of course is Donald Trump's son-in-law. There are many people who hold strong opinions of this fellow, both positive and negative. I can't say that I have any particularly strong opinions about him, but Michelle Goldberg of the New York Times certainly does. She writes, reporting on the White House's herky-jerky coronavirus response, Vanity Fair's Gabriel Sherman has a quotation from Jared Kushner that should make all Americans, and particularly all New Yorkers, dizzy with terror. According to Sherman, when New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo said that the state would need 30,000 ventilators at the apex of the coronavirus outbreak, Kushner decided that Cuomo was being alarmist. I have all this data about ICU capacity, Kushner reportedly said. I'm doing my own projections, and I've gotten a lot smarter about this. New York doesn't need all the ventilators. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the country's top expert on infectious diseases, has said he trusts Cuomo's estimate. Even now, it's hard to believe that someone with as little expertise as Kushner could be so arrogant, but he said something similar on Thursday when he made his debut at the White House's daily coronavirus briefing. People who have requests for different products and supplies, a lot of them are doing it based on projections, which are not the realistic projections. Now, as I said many times, I don't believe a single word about the Trump White House that comes from Vanity Fair or the rest of the mainstream media. It's all made up. But this is what journalists, so-called, now do. They speak to each other and then report it as news. Goldberg says it's hard to overstate the extent to which this confidence, that is Trump's confidence, is unearned. Kushner was reportedly a mediocre student whose billionaire father appears to have bought him a place at Harvard. And I'm sure there are no other people at the New York Times who were mediocre students whose rich parents bought them a place at Harvard. It's all too funny that I don't know, these are the last days for the media? It would seem so. I mean, they're reduced to one story, and the story is that Trump lied and people died, and they are going to continue to peddle this story regardless of what, say, Andrew Cuomo, governor of New York, might have to say about Donald Trump and his response to New York's crisis. But let's talk about black boxes. Black box fever. Catch it. It turns out that the real rulers of the world are the computer modelers. And they've never been wrong about anything. And their black boxes tell us exactly what will happen in the future. I suppose this is rather like the medieval goal of turning lead into gold. But in this case, it's turning computer code into the future. Again, according to the New York Times, leading disease forecasters whose research the White House used to conclude that 100,000 to 240,000 people will die nationwide from the coronavirus were mystified when they saw the administration's projection this week. The experts said they don't challenge the numbers' validity, but said they don't know how the White House arrived at them. Well, given that Dr. Neil Ferguson's model from Imperial College London is indeed a black box, and he will not make his computer code available, I don't see why the White House's modeling would be any less trustworthy than the good Dr. Ferguson's. White House figures have refused to explain how they generated the figure, a death toll bigger than the United States suffered in the Vietnam War or the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. They have not provided the underlying data so others can assess its reliability, and have not provided long-term strategies to lower that death count. Some of President Trump's top advisors have expressed doubts about the estimate. Yeah, sure they have. Again, why don't you name some names? According to 3 White House officials who spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to speak publicly. Yes, 3 anonymous White House officials. There have been fierce debates inside the White House about its accuracy. At a task force meeting this week, according to 2 officials with direct knowledge of it, Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, told others that there are too many variables at play in the pandemic to make the models reliable. Quote, I've looked at all the models. I've spent a lot of time on the models. They don't tell you anything. You can't really rely upon models, unquote. Seems sensible enough to me. Jeffrey Shaman, a Columbia University epidemiologist, and epidemiologists are the best people in the world, whose models were cited by the White House, said his own work on the pandemic doesn't go far enough into the future to make predictions akin to the White House fatality forecast. We don't have a sense of what's going on in the here and now, and we don't know what people will do in the future, he said. We don't know if the virus is seasonal. The estimate appeared to be a rushed affair, said Mark Lipsitch, an epidemiologist, top person, and the director of Harvard University's Center for Communicable Disease Dynamics. Quote, they contacted us, I think, on a Tuesday a week ago and asked for answers and feedback by Thursday, basically 24 hours. My initial response was, we can't do it that fast, but we ended up providing them some numbers responding to very specific scenarios. Well, we're all just stabbing in the dark here. And of course, if the numbers, the dead from COVID-19, coronavirus, or Wu flu, whatever you choose to call it, turn out to be much lower than the worst predictions, 2.2 million, say, then the epidemiologists and our leaders are going to pat themselves on the back, as I predicted several weeks ago, and say, congratulate themselves for what a fine job they did by destroying the economy and abolishing society. Let's see. Again, though, this is from the Washington Post. As virus takes hold, resistance to stay-at-home orders remains widespread, exposing political and social rifts. You remember after Trump was elected, a fairly large number of people, particularly, I suppose, amongst the never-Trumpers and the celebrity class, proclaimed themselves to be members of La Résistance. But now, apparently, resistance is a bad thing, not a good thing. Kay Ivey, the Republican governor of Alabama, put down a marker last week in affirming that it was not the time to order people to shelter in place. Y'all, we are not Louisiana, we are not New York State, we are not California, she said, suggesting that the fate of hard-hit parts of the country would not be shared by Alabama. In Missouri, Republican Governor Mike Parsons said he was not inclined to make a blanket policy, adding, it's going to come down to individual responsibilities. And in Florida, where Governor Ron DeSantis issued a statewide stay-at-home order this week under growing pressure as his state's death toll mounted, a Tampa area megachurch pastor who was arrested for holding services in violation of a local order announced Thursday he was considering reopening the church in time for Easter and is praying and seeking the Lord for wisdom. Well, I certainly hope that he opens the church for Easter. I certainly hope that all churches are open for Easter. As I never tire of pointing out, Christians have been celebrating Easter for almost 2,000 years. They celebrated while they were in the catacombs, and now apparently Easter, Lent, Holy Week, and Easter have been canceled because of a virus. A growing number of states and cities are restricting Americans' movements in response to a fast-spreading pandemic likely to claim hundreds of thousands of lives worldwide. Yes, and how many hundreds of thousands of people would have died just if there were no coronavirus? This is a question that these people never ask themselves. As I've mentioned before, something like 2.8 million people die every year in the United States. Government and private sector leaders across a large swath of the country remain defiant that the devastation unfolding in New York and other seemingly faraway cities should not curtail life in their own communities. Oh dear. In some cases, skeptics have been slow to acknowledge the science behind the spread of the novel coronavirus. In others, such as Florida, politicians took heed of demands from the business community, which lobbied DeSantis as recently as during a Monday webinar to balance medical imperatives with economic needs. Elsewhere, adamance about local autonomy was pronounced. Some, meanwhile, maintained that it was religious authority that mattered. While we do not know for certain what the future holds or how long this disruption will last, we can all rest in knowing that God is in control, the conservative Christian founder and chief executive of the craft store chain Hobby Lobby, which opened stores in a handful of places against state orders, wrote in a letter to his employees. Experts are now warning that a group of governors in the South and the Great Plains, largely Republican-led states, risk acting too late. Alabama, for example, has more than 1,100 cases. Oh, dear, 1,100, that many, with just 5 counties untouched by the virus. New infections have risen as sharply as in California. In some cases, the resistance has led to rising political tensions, with often Democratic mayors imposing orders of their own that they acknowledge have limited effect when surrounding jurisdictions do not act. As a city, we need to operate as if we could be anywhere else, said Mayor Randall Woodfin of Birmingham, Alabama. I think we're in the middle of the storm. I think that Birmingham, Alabama has rather more severe problems than the coronavirus. Lyda Crewson, the mayor of St. Louis, said her city's stay-at-home order was undermined by the absence of a blanket policy warning. We have a fluid society, frankly. I feel like the entire country ought to be under a stay-at-home order, Crewson said in an interview. And again, the price of matriarchy is eternal panic. The pleas have not been from politicians alone. Joining Crewson and others in appealing to the Missouri governor was the state's medical association, which sent a letter to Parson saying a statewide order was the only way to curb the exponential spread of COVID-19 in Missouri. In Texas, the state's Hospital and Nurses Association sent a joint letter to the Republican governor, Greg Abbott, telling him the time has come for Texas to issue a statewide stay-at-home order. Abbott announced a new statewide directive Tuesday, but refused to call it a statewide order. Yes, freedom. We're all in favor of freedom, right? Aren't we? I was reminded today of something that Malcolm X had to say on this subject. He was an interesting and clever man, Malcolm X, far more so than the sainted Reverend Dr. Luther King, who was clearly a dullard. Malcolm X said, if you're not prepared to die for it, put the word freedom out of your vocabulary. Well, you know, as far as freedom goes these days, we have so little regard for it that we are literally terrified to leave our own houses. And how sad is that? Let's go to the chat. Chogokin666 says, I know it's time for KMG when I hear NPCs clapping and blowing vuvuzelas out their windows. Yes, for the second time, I heard some pot banging in my apartment building. There didn't seem to be very many people doing it. Perhaps it was just one apartment. From the same person, usually very friendly lady, freaked out because I was standing in the lobby today. This is really bringing out the neurosis. The lipped one says, massive paranoia all over. Yes, indeed. Indeed. Jonathan Pohl says Harvard has educated more stupid people than any other university in world history. Disgraced Courtier says New York only has a crisis because of de Blasio. David Wright says Conan, I presumably that's Conan O'Brien, said Harvard is full of stupid people he attended. Let's see. John Berkshire says nothing wrong with Zionism. Walrus Libertarian says we have to find the bat who started this. Again from Disgraced Courtier, King Kush was chatting on the Babscast chat. He is in bad shape. I hope he pulls through. Forced atomization and hysteria. Well, yes, apparently that is our future. That is our future. And again, oh, Dan Ellison says Governor DeSantis is letting Florida churches open. Well, I certainly hope so. And Alex DeLarge says this is a puerile take, KMG. Well, all my takes are puerile, aren't they? 6.6 million jobless claims. Yeah, well, I guess if you decide to destroy the economy, you're going to get millions of jobless claims. Jagmeet. Is that a reference to Jagmeet Singh, the leader of Canada's New Democratic Party? Seriously, yes, his name is Jagmeet Singh. Mary Crow says Clark Ashton Smith and Richard Wilbur did some good Baudelaire translations. I've checked out many, but I do like Roy Campbell the best. Alex DeLarge says people are getting assaulted for coughing. Yes, as Gogol said, one laughs lest one weep. A piece from Matthew Walther in The Week. Social distancing is going to get darker. What is it? It's not the worst if you can say this is the worst. This is what Shakespeare said. He writes, if the sort of things that most of us are seeing on social media and in our favorite publications is any indication, life under lockdown or shelter in place or whatever we are now calling the unilateral suspension of civilization across roughly half the globe is some kind of secular retreat. Here, finally, we are told, is a chance to read all those books gathering dust on the shelves, but not for long. We're cleaning, you see, and learning how to sew and make orange macaroons and play German board games with 450-page instruction manuals. Do things, we keep telling each other. Go on Zoom with grandma, start a Proust club, or host a virtual craft beer tasting. Play a video game with your dog. There is nothing wrong with these serial inducements to government-approved indoor activity. Making the best of a bad situation is a universal human impulse and a more or less wholesome one. But it's important to recognize that for every person bent on using the coronavirus pandemic as an excuse to brush up on Urdu or figure out what to do with a fridge full of ricotta and lemons, there are just as many others for whom no amount of buck-up self-improvement will make this experience better than miserable. Let's start with people who have no choice but to be in close quarters with those from whom they would be better off far away. Already there are reports, both in the United States and abroad, of increased domestic violence under lockdown conditions. Well, I'm hardly surprised by this. Let's see. No employment plus no society plus panic equals violence and murder. It seems a pretty straightforward equation to me. Walter continues, as usual, the people on the receiving end of most of this are children and women who are running into pharmacies shouting code words. The French government is booking hotel rooms for thousands of women fleeing violent men with whom they would otherwise be stuck for weeks or months. This situation is only going to get worse. Even for those who are not facing the terrible threat of assault or worse by members of their households, there are significant concerns related to mental health. People already inclined to depression and anxiety are unlikely to improve their situation under the present conditions. I cannot be the only American of late who has found himself taking his temperature obsessively. We magnify every tiny would-be symptom. My back hurts opposite my lungs. Is this new? For about 15 seconds there, I had a slight metallic taste in my mouth. Wait, is that a cough? In the vast majority of cases, what we are experiencing is of no importance. Alas, even hypochondriacs will think twice about running to the pharmacy or the nearest urgent care facility. Instead, they will remain at home, driving themselves mad. This is to say nothing of the very real possibility of more incidents like the recent attempt by a man in Los Angeles to drive a train into a Navy ship serving as a makeshift hospital. As usual, the motivation here, apparently some conspiracy theory, is not relevant in any formal sense. Speculating about the reasons a train engineer might have for thinking he would make the world a better place by attacking a seaborne medical facility is a fool's errand. The man is a lunatic, and like many lunatics before him, and I dare say many to come, thank heaven no one was injured. But how would our country respond right now to what we call mass shootings or other acts of domestic terrorism? Are states like Virginia that have extended shelter-in-place orders through June ready for what could prove to be a long, hot summer? Ours is, not to put too fine a point on it, a sick country under what passes for ordinary circumstances. What should we expect to happen when we subject our already atomized population to months of enforced social isolation amid a likely economic depression? Misery and violence, perhaps widespread. None of this should be taken to suggest that things must return to normal immediately. But we should acknowledge that there are real human costs to the shuttering of life as we knew it. These are costs that have nothing to do with GDP statistics or the prices of stocks. Man is a social animal, an animal who becomes himself in the society of others. We should not be even remotely surprised when, deprived of that society, of his own volition or otherwise, he starts to behave like a different sort of animal. Our response to this pandemic is not a vacation. It is not an adventure, a learning experience, an opportunity for improving your mind or developing new skills and hobbies, though more power to you. I suppose if you do manage any of those things under the circumstances, it is a series of desperate measures, indeed, constitutionally speaking, the most desperate in modern history, undertaken, one hopes, with the utmost reluctance. In order to save the possibility of normal life in the future, we must suspend it now. We should at least do so in full knowledge of what it's likely to mean. I'm very amused when I hear people carry on about all of the wonderful things they're going to do or learn now that they're isolated to their homes. I think that many people who've been unemployed for a significant period of time have said, now I finally have the time to learn Italian or whatever, and no, they never get around to it. You know, learning Italian or such like is like any other thing in life. If you want it enough, you will make the time. There are very few people, as it turns out, who are suited to lives of leisure. And this is one of the most terrifying things that's going to come out of this lockdown. That, I don't know, people are going to, if they don't die of panic, they're going to start dying of boredom. Let's see, from the Louisville Courier Journal, 2 Louisville coronavirus patients and a family member have been ordered by circuit judges to isolate and wear tracking devices after health officials learned they'd been in public against medical advice. Issuing health-related civil orders is new territory for the courts, according to Judge Charles Cunningham, who issued 2 Friday. The third was issued earlier this month when a South End resident who tested positive for coronavirus refused to self-isolate. Yes, apparently it is the young people among us who are flouting the lockdown. In George Orwell's 1984, he famously said that the proles will save us, and I'm hoping that in this lockdown hysteria, it will be the young people who save us. What are they going to do? Are they going to arrest thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people for leaving their homes, even at a time when the police across North America have pretty much denounced that they're not going to do their jobs anymore because, you know, contact with other people is pretty dodgy. No, I really think that this is a paper tiger. Rush Limbaugh has been much in the news. He has advanced cancer, and he's not going to be alive for much longer. And so I suppose people will say, well, he would say what he's saying because he is dying soon, so he doesn't give a toss about anyone else. In any event, according to Breitbart, conservative radio host Rush Limbaugh warned Americans Thursday during his broadcast of the Democrats' attempt to use the crisis of the coronavirus as a means to decapitate the U.S. capitalist economy. Quote, so they're seeing this as an opportunity to decapitate the United States capitalist economy, and they are salivating over it. For them, it's the crisis opportunity of a lifetime to push through their agenda. Despite this, despite the fact that the facts show that it is capitalism and farmers and frackers and truckers who are saving us, people in many industries the left impugns and laughs at and makes fun of. They make fun of farmers. They make fun of people in flyover country. They make fun of people who make their living in the dirt. They make fun of people who take showers after work. They impugn all kinds of people in manual labor jobs. We would not be able to survive this without them. Yes, I suppose it's really been brought home to me in recent years how divorced we are from the sources of our wealth, from the sources of our well-being. That apparently money is made, by, like Jez said on Peep Show, drinking smoothies, playing the Xbox. That's how people, make money. We're not making pig iron in our houses. Yes, people who work with their hands. Oh, these are the worst people. There's a very high likelihood there that they would hold really repellent political views and, dare I say, vote for Donald Trump. Rush Limbaugh continued, and by the way, thank God for getting rid of net neutrality, because if we hadn't got rid of it, and if there were these kinds of left-wing regulations on the internet, it wouldn't be up and running as it is today. Go to the UK, go to the European Union, you'll find out that the internet and broadband service over there has been greatly interrupted in all this because they have massive more regulation of the internet than we do. So Limbaugh ties this into the Green New Deal. You people, and he's talking about Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats, you people tried to shut it down, that is capitalism, with your Green New Deal. What do you mean? You're the biggest hypocrite that's come along during this crisis. Clean water, who the hell is opposed to it? What do you mean we need clean water initiatives in the infrastructure bill? Is there anybody out there in favor of dirty water? Who is opposed to this? Tracking devices, they're going to be permanent, right? I mean, certainly they're going to be people advocating for tracking devices. Everyone must have a tracking device. The old tin foil hat conspiracy theory that the government wanted to put barcodes on us or tracking devices. And now it's happening. And, well, there's a virus out there, so it's totally justified. Well, what happens when it ends? Can we allow people just to go anywhere they like without being tracked by the state? I mean, these people could have viruses. Sounds pretty irresponsible, doesn't it? Earlier this week, on Wednesday, Rush Limbaugh said the economic shutdown is unsustainable, stressing that the uncertainty over an eventual startup date is only aggravating the problem. This is from the Daily Wire. The host also noted the hostility toward anyone who dares raise economic devastation as part of the America's COVID-19 response equation, which he argued is being incorrectly framed as lives versus money when it's actually measuring lives versus life. Quote, we simply cannot, with no end in sight, go on like this. We cannot be in the midst of this economy being shut down with no end in sight. The host said the so-called mitigation timeline offered to Americans from the Trump administration is unhelpful. It's not going to work, he said. Now they can tell us, well, we think in 2 weeks we'll be able to relax things, and then those 2 weeks go by and they can't. They'll say, oh, give us another 2 weeks, because they think that we can live with waiting an additional 2 weeks every 2 weeks. I'm reminded of an episode of 30 Rock when Matt Damon played a pilot who was in a relationship with Liz Lemon, and he told her a pilot's secret, that when you have these planes which are on the runway forever, and people are getting panicky and desperate. And, well, how long is it going to be? And he said, well, I just tell them it's going to be about half an hour. And that relaxes them because, you know, it is a wait, but it's not that long a wait. And of course, okay, it's been half an hour. Why aren't we taking off? It's going to be about another half an hour. And you can keep doing this for a long time. Limbaugh said, if they tell us 6 months, that won't work. But there's an overriding problem with this, and it is the uncertainty combined with nobody talking about it. Right now, all of the talk is about medical. All the talk is about the horrible medical statistics, predictions, models. All the talk is apocalyptic when we're discussing the virus. It's all apocalyptic. It's all the end of the world. It's all end of this. It's all death. It's all new numbers, 2.2 million, 240,000. Meanwhile, everybody's at home, the economy shut down, everyone realizes this can't go on, but there is this degree of uncertainty as to when this is going to end. It cannot go on like this. At some point, folks, we as a country are going to have to answer a question. How much of the economy do we let drift towards Great Depression status before we stop it? So, Rush Limbaugh is a COVID-19 denier, which is like being a climate change denier or like being a Holocaust denier, I suppose. Should he be allowed on the air to spread his message of not panic? Well, let's see, Jonathan V. Last, who was with the Bulwark, which is one of these little, boutique, never Trump operations. He was formerly of the Weekly Standard, if I remember correctly, has a piece called The Malicious Irresponsibility of Rush Limbaugh. This vile, foolish man has blood on his hands. Yes, the broke line was everyone who disagrees with me is a Nazi. The woke line is everyone who disagrees with me is a mass murderer. He begins on March the 31st. Over a 24-hour period, 1,049 Americans died from COVID-19. Again, I will remind listeners, viewers, that every year 2.8 million people die in the United States. That's the official number for now. As we're seeing in Italy, the real number may be higher. Well, how much higher? Twice as high? 3 times? 10 times as high? Is it possible that half the population of Italy has died and they're keeping it secret? Let's just pretend that the 1049 number is right. See, these people, they're basing their arguments on numbers. And then they say, well, the numbers aren't any good because they're all too low. Well, you're not basing your argument on numbers then. You're just fear mongering. Put in context, that makes it one of the deadliest single days in U.S. history. If 1,000 people died every day, and there are 365 days in the year, well, that would be 365,000. So 1,049 is roughly, it's close to 400,000. Again, so 400,000, 2.8 million people die every year in the United States. How can we have people pontificating about this when they have no idea of such basic facts as how many people die every year? Oh, and he talks about the geometric progression I kept shouting about weeks ago. The New York Times does a nice job trying to hold to account some of the people from Conservatism Inc. who work to prevent Americans from taking COVID-19 seriously. But honestly, it's not enough. When this is all over, there should be a reckoning, a very real, very thorough reckoning for all the people who made this pandemic worse by pushing disinformation and lies in the service of making it harder for the country to respond to this crisis. Okay, then. If apparently you need, I believe, what was it, MIT or Harvard said, you need to stay 24 to 27 feet away from every other person on Earth at all times to avoid exposure to the virus. And if the virus lives on metal surfaces, such as faucets and doorknobs, for 9 days, everyone in the United States is already infected. So, a reckoning. It's pretty amusing when neocons talk about a reckoning, because if there was any justice on this earth, all of the people responsible for the invasion of Iraq would be permanently in sackcloth and ashes. But we still take these people seriously. Let's see, let's talk about Rush Limbaugh, because what this man has said over the last month ought to mark him for the rest of his life. It's just the projection from these people. The neocons have been wrong about every single thing. The neocons were saying in the 1980s that the Soviet Union had developed a first strike strategy. That is to say that they thought that they could survive a nuclear war. They intended to hit the United States hard and fast. And they were building a civil defense system in order to ride out the response. Well, the CIA said, no, we don't believe that's true. And Richard Pearl, the dean of the neocons, demanded of Ronald Reagan or his staff that we can't trust the CIA, or we need to do our own study. And so the resources were given to Richard Pearl and his pals to do their own study. And guess what? The same results as the CIA. There was no indication that the Soviet Union was drastically ramping up its civil defenses. You know what the neocons said? They said that the fact that there is no evidence of this makes it even scarier, because now we know that it's true. That's neocon logic for you. Yes, and let's see, the spread of cancer, AYFKM. I can't believe I have to say this to a guy who has cancer, but cancer is not an infectious disease. How in God's earth can Limbaugh talk like this, telling people that suppressing the spread of COVID-19 is impossible because we haven't been able to stop the spread of cancer, and not be looked at as a dangerous and irresponsible crank? No, I think he's rather than missing the point about what Limbaugh said. Richard Nixon, who was urged on to do this by the advice columnist Ann Landers, declared a war on cancer when he was president in the early 1970s. And what? Hundreds of billions of dollars and trillions of dollars have been spent on this war on cancer. And apart from pediatric cancer, the medical professionals have made little headway. In fact, there's still no understanding of why cancer happens. I think that that's what Rush Limbaugh was referring to. But what does the squad think of all this? AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She tweets today, COVID deaths are disproportionately spiking in Black and brown communities. I should be waving, gesticulating wildly, I suppose, if I'm going to impersonate AOC. Why? Because the chronic toll of redlining, environmental racism, wealth gap, etc., are underlying health conditions. Inequality is a comorbidity. COVID relief should be drafted with a lens of reparations. Drafted with a lens of reparations. That's a delicious mixed metaphor. Yeah, this is I suppose this was easily predictable, that COVID-19 has been racialized, as the woke people like to say. People are all over the internet saying, oh, yes, it's the racist system that's killing all these Black and brown people. Well, you know, different racial demographics have different lifestyles and different habits, particularly with regard to their use of food and drink. As I pointed out yesterday, amongst Black people in the United States, their rates of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, et cetera, are off the charts compared to white people. So yes, COVID-19 is going to hit them disproportionately high. But, they have no agency. This is what we hear over and over again. There's no agency. If you want to live on a diet of food made of corn syrup, well, I guess racism is responsible for that. Peter Hitchens, who has been keeping up his brave and mostly lonely fight against the sanitary dictatorship, writes today, it's interesting that Sweden's thoughtful choice, which is as informed by experts as ours, different experts, is invariably reported as a dangerous experiment, whereas Britain's decision to trash its economy and attack liberties is reported as normal. Can anyone explain? This is ironic, given that isn't Sweden for decades supposed to have been a model for us? I know certainly it was a model for Canada. Here's how Sweden works. That the experts get together and they decide that Sweden is going to do this or that. And then it is announced as a fait accompli to the people. And you're not a proper Swede if you disagree. So the Swedes, in their wisdom, have decided not to panic, as neighboring countries have. And Sweden is now the bad guy. Too funny. Let's see. What does the Daily Mail have to tell us? UK announces 684 more coronavirus victims today. Total death toll reaches 3,605, and more than 38,000 people have now tested positive for the infection. As Matt Hancock warns, there could be 1,000 deaths per day by Easter. Well, if you were going to blame every death on coronavirus, when people have the coronavirus, yes, you're going to get an awful lot of deaths. Kate Garraway's husband is in intensive care with coronavirus, as she is a TV presenter. Sell one of your 3 yachts. Outrage as billionaire Sir Philip Green asks for taxpayer help to pay emergency wages to 14,500 workers he has furloughed. The Queen will address Britain on the coronavirus after recording a special broadcast at Windsor Castle that will be aired at 8 p.m. on Sunday. The Premier League, that's soccer or football, as I suppose it should be pronounced. Premier League clubs are asking their players to take wage cuts of up to 30% and will donate £20 million to the NHS, but won't return to action until it is safe. This doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, most of the people who watch Premier League football watch it on television. So it's perfectly possible to hold their soccer matches in empty stadiums. Why don't they do that? You notice that sports got on board the panic right at the very beginning of the panic. And that shows you just how indicative, how important sports are to us now. Let's see, thousands of Sky broadband customers across the south of England struggle to work from home after a network fault leaves them without internet access for up to 6 hours. Yeah, I guess that would be the last straw for a lot of people. That, okay, have to stay home, can't go out, society is over, everything is virtual. So the internet has everything that I need. Oh, wait, there's no internet anymore? I still have a high temperature. Boris Johnson reveals he will not be out of coronavirus self-isolation today because he still has symptoms. Golly, just like Justin Trudeau. You know that the totalitarianism is justified because I, myself, am sick. Well, maybe not sick, but I tested positive for coronavirus, or so I say. And I'm going to isolate for 14 days. No, 14 days isn't enough, because if I come out of isolation, this might suggest to others that this isolation has been hyped. That it's been hyped. Oh, here's an interesting story. you might remember, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, I was talking about in the 1970s, I used to see in drugstores, and apparently this product goes back to the 1940s. It was a patent medicine for people who wanted to lose weight, and it was called AIDS, and it was spelled AIDS. Now, in the 1980s, when everyone was scared to death of AIDS, AIDS, which turned out to be a paper tiger for people who were not male homosexuals and IV drug users, the people who owned the AIDS medicine said, "We're not changing our name. We were here first." Well, that resolution didn't last very long, and the company went out of business. So the Mail reports Corona beer suspends production due to coronavirus. The brand of lager, whose unfortunate name has made it a punchline during the health crisis, will not be produced after Mexico deemed it non-essential. Fears of a shortage have prompted panic buying, with pictures from Mexican shops showing trolleys piled up with beer. The brewery Grupo Modelo, and if I'm correct, this is part of the InBev Anheuser-Busch behemoth. It's just not really a Mexican beer at all. Said it was scaling down its operations to a bare minimum. However, the company suggested it could keep brewing beer if its operations were deemed to be agriculture, which is allowed. It seems to me to be a misjudgment by the government of Mexico. It's my understanding that Mexicans are quite fond of beer. Okay, let's have a look at the chat, see what's going on there. Ricky Bullock says, Trudeau using isolation as an excuse to dodge questions about his marriage, as if the Canadian media would have the guts to ask about it. Yes, I recall some years ago that a fellow who'd been a top Canadian civil servant, and he was sort of in and out of the media, he had made a claim about the marriage of Stephen Harper, who was prime minister at the time, specifically that they had split up or had been living separately for some time. And the reaction in the mainstream media was, "How dare you?" Well, there was a French president who died, and Pompidou. After his death, it was revealed that he had two families. There was his wife, his legal wife, and he had a bunch of children with her. And then was this other woman who was like a sister wife, and he had a bunch of children with her. And he'd sort of gone back and forth between these families for years. But apparently it was not the business of the French people to know what I would think would be a very significant fact about their president, that he was in effect a polygamist. Trudeau has used his wife and his children as props. You know, politicians are particularly fond of this really disgusting hypocrisy, where they use here's my pretty wife, here's my pretty children, aren't they cute? You have no right to ask me about my wife and my children. That is private. Well, if it's so private, why are you trotting them out with you constantly? Why are you posing for photographs? I mean, maybe some of you have seen the photographs of Justin Trudeau when he was in India. Justin is a drama kid who never grew up, and he loves dressing up, and he loved blackface. And so he's in India on a trip that was like 10 days or something. Canadian politicians of all parties have been campaigning for votes in India for decades now. Yeah, that's how bad it is in my country. Anyway, so he's in India, and he's there with the wife and the kids. And so he's dressed up like a Maharaja, and his wife is dressed up as whatever they would call the wife of a Maharaja. And his children are dressed up like the children of a Maharaja. Something about cultural appropriation. Let's see. Jonathan Paul says, stop freaking out. I lived through Ebola in West Africa and there was no quarantine. Okay, and there's some disputes. People are finding issue with Alex DeLarge. Chad Chadson said, I just finished God, Emperor of Dune, a great series. Okay. Okay, I just finished, Jonathan Paul says, I just finished reading Vorkuta, Gulag Town, Company Town. That, I'm reminded in that regard that Kingsley Amis, he wrote several books on the subject of alcohol, taken from, compiled from newspaper columns. They have been republished in one volume. It's a great read. But people wake up with hangovers. They often feel, distress, anxiety, kind of paranoia. And he had some solutions for this, some tricks, And he said, read One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Solzhenitsyn, which will, convince you that no matter how bad you think your life is, there are people with worse lives. And he also suggested listening to music by John Coltrane. And he said that, if you think that the world is ugly and useless, well, listen to John Coltrane and you'll find out that apparently it's possible to be even more ugly and useless. Let's see, the looked one says, just in, Fauci is a Chinese operative, real name, Ang Lee. Fauci. Yeah. MCT says, I have only worn masks during Mardi Gras. They might not be affected. Disgraced Courtier says, mission accomplished, fellow gamers. We destroyed society. Alex DeLarge says, get people producing cloth masks. I don't, again, I'm not taking sides in this controversy, and it seems to be rather useless because you have these people practically screaming, say, everyone should be wearing masks. Now, on the other hand, Dr. Teresa Tam, who is a native of China, who is Canada's chief medical expert, she's the one who told us at the very beginning of this that the real disease was stigmatization, xenophobia, stigma. She keeps claiming that it would be useless for people to wear masks. So, as I say, not going to take a stand on it. Ricky Bullock says, I think not recommending masks because there's already a shortage for medical personnel is a pretty good excuse. Yes, I think it is. If people are to wear masks, then obviously the medical personnel should get the masks first. Disgraced Courtier says, KMG, youths is a euphemism. Almost half of coronavirus cases are melanin enriched. Yeah, I'm sure this is true. I'm sure this is true. And I said, anyone could have predicted that. Anyone who knows anything about American demographics could have predicted that. David Wright says, I wonder if Rush's addiction to opioids compromised his immune system and set him up for cancer. Well, I don't know, but when I read years ago about how many tablets of oxycodone or whatever it was he was taking every day, I thought, this sounds like enough to paralyze an elephant. I mean, the guy must have a tremendous constitution. Okay, let's see. Oh, yes, people are talking in the chat about this Jewish chap in New York who was hoarding masks and intending to sell them for 700% profit. And when he was arrested, he deliberately coughed on the FBI agents. Lecomte de Boreas says, stop watching CNN, nocebo effect is real. Yes, I definitely believe that it is real, and it's only going to get worse unless, God willing, Trump decides to call off the social distancing in time for May the 1st. Okay. People talking about oil stocks. Yeah, they can't be in very good shape. I suppose the good news is that eventually there's going to be shortages, and the price of oil is going to soar. But as Kunstler has pointed out, this whipsaw effect is terrible for us, and it seems to be permanent. When oil is over $75 a barrel, the economy sinks. But when oil is under $75 a barrel, the oil companies sink. And we're going to keep using oil until we run out of it, whenever that will be. And it is become more and more expensive to find new sources of oil. Fracking is a chimera. It's too expensive. Rex Tillerson, who was CEO of ExxonMobil before he became Trump's first Secretary of State, lamented in an interview a few years ago that they couldn't make fracking work at $100 a barrel. Let's see. Ricky Bullock says, I just left the house for the first time in a couple of days because I was waiting on my test results, went to the store and noticed one of the big used lots has gotten rid of all of its inventory. Yeah, my experience, there seem to be a lot fewer people in the store, or in Save on Foods, actually, which is the superstore. It's about 3/4 of a mile from where I live, where I do my shopping. I'm going to guess from this that this is it's the result of panic. Maybe people have stored up enough groceries to keep them going for 2 or 3 weeks, and they just don't want to expose themselves to others. So, but I was going to say this is cutting down on my shopping time, but not really, because people are avoiding the cashiers and using the self-serve option instead. So there's often lineups for that. Do you have a rental in Victoria, BC? No, I do not yet have a place to live. I may be forced to move into a hotel, assuming that hotels are still admitting new guests. His wife gave Idris Elba a coronavirus. That would be Sophie Gregoire Trudeau. Well, I saw on Crazy Days and Nights the rumor being spread that Idris Elba actually never had coronavirus, which is, it's not the sort of thing that anyone would admit to. And again, I'm suspicious of these famous people who, telling everyone that they have coronavirus. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But celebrities lie routinely in aid of their public image. Always have, always will. Ryan Landry, who has returned to the internet after several years away from it. Quite a bright young fellow. He writes today, they are trying to distract you with China. China is at fault here, no denying this. China also is not responsible for the policies of the American elite that allowed America to be susceptible to a random virus halfway around the world. The neocons want to make people angry enough at China that they stop pushing for all the policies that populists want that are vindicated by the current crisis. Stick to pushing populist nationalist policies. Never let a crisis go to waste. As people look around and understand how broken everything is, offer them a coherent initiative. On the subject of immigration, open borders is death. Moratorium now. Borders are shut down anyway, and with the job losses we are seeing, there is no reason to bring any immigrants in. Exactly. I remember years ago, I was talking with a friend about the Turkish Gastarbeiter, guest workers in Germany, and he said, with the 1973 oil shock, there was no more reason for Germany to be bringing these people in. And I thought, I never thought of that before. And of course, why did they bring these people in? To lower wages. Immigration has two main purposes. One is forced diversity, which helps left-wing parties. That's why the lefties support it. And Conservatism Inc. supports it because it lowers wages. It's that simple. The 1% must keep getting richer because that's what my economy is all about. Ryan Landry continues, due to the disease, it is a national security risk to bring in any immigrants now. Had America stricter controls, we would not have been seated as easily. Our first case was in Washington from a person who returned from China. A closed door for a generation means no first case. Regardless, if only 30,000 or even 3,000 Chinese nationals were students in America instead of 350,000, we would have had a much smaller chance of being seated with cases that we all knew were coming in during January. This applies to any outbreak. Modify the butterfly flaps its wing concept. Does this policy put my family more at risk due to an outbreak 8,000 miles away, or does it protect my family? In manufacturing, he says, for decades, we watched as Wall Street and government policymakers shepherded manufacturing supply chains offshore, and not just to Mexico for NAFTA benefits, but to China. This was a 30-year process. These jobs need to be brought back to America, and if not America, immediate trade partners like China and Mexico. This is national security. Lives should never be held hostage to the decisions of potential enemies. On PC and multi-culti language policing, he says, the American media has focused on Chinese virus and Wuhan virus when far more pressing matters are in people's minds, because language and speech is how they handle every domestic issue. They control how and what is said inside the Overton window, manipulate procedures, and wins. Corona does not care. This language policing is showing what it is in a real crisis, idiotic scolding. The other portion of this is the CDC, FDA health experts have spent years worrying about the health effects of microaggressions and stigma to the point where this limited our response and altered our messaging. As America could not profile Muslims after 9/11, America could not contact, trace, and quarantine every Asian who came into the nation from China in January. Modify the butterfly flaps its wings concept. Does this policy put my family more at risk due to an outbreak 8,000 miles away, or does it protect my family? On bureaucratic procedures and credentialism, he says, the failure of our expert class with this outbreak from local to national and from bureaucrat to journalist is Chernobyl-esque. Name and shame them all. If regulations get waived in a national emergency, why is the regulation in place at all? Why are these individuals the decision makers when it comes to life and death? What is the sense of all those credentials if a swarm of anonymous right-wing Twitter accounts can see a crisis coming, analyze the concerns, recommend policies, and also do their normal 9-to-5 jobs on the side? Every single item the nationalists have argued since 2015 have been proven more effective as a framework for viewing the world and handling concerns of national import. Now, I used to be a magazine columnist. I had a column about the news, and I had a column about television. And I noticed something about columnists, that they pretty much all say the same thing. And I suppose that there is a, if you like, left-wing version of that and a right-wing version of that. And I decided that if my opinion was the same as everyone else's on any given topic, I wasn't going to write about the subject. Because why does anyone need the 749th version or a reiteration of the same thing? I don't, I was a journalist for many years, and I used to be quite fond of journalists, but they all say the same things now. They don't do any thinking. Everything they write is reflexive or inane. Typically, they take no care over their choice of words, their choice of metaphors, the way they structure their sentences or paragraphs. It's difficult to read any columnist and not find a horrendous mixed metaphor crash up in every single one of their columns. In fact, when I was an editor, I used to warn my writers to be very wary of using metaphors. Typically, they are mangled, or they are just cliches. They are not. They don't illuminate. anything. Well, we all hate the boomers, of course, and there are many people out there cheering for their genocide. And Jim Kunstler, who is a boomer, although he is an early boomer, he was born in 1948, not a late boomer like myself. He writes, today, history will probably record that America's baby boom generation threw one hell of a party. Gen X was left with the sorry task of cleanup crew, and the millennials ended up squatting in the repossessed haunted party house when it was all over. On behalf of the boomers, let me try to explain and apologize. We came along at the end of history's earlier biggest trauma, the Second World War, following the hard stumble of the Great Depression, which, by the way, for those of you unsure of chronology, followed the First World War, an epic, purposeless slaughter that utterly demoralized Western civilization. What a setup for my parents' generation. My stepfather, the man who raised me, was an interesting specimen of that generation. Fresh out of college in Boston, he joined the army, became a lieutenant, and by found himself trapped in the German offensive through the Ardennes forest known as the Battle of the Bulge. Unlike some World War II vets, he was willing to talk about his experiences. His most vivid memory was the difference between the sound of American and German machine guns. Ours went rat-a-tat-tat, theirs went zap, he said, like you couldn't even detect the interval between the bullets coming at you. It scared the piss out of his men, not a few of whom were cut to pieces. My stepfather merely caught several chunks of shrapnel in his arm and thigh and was still on the scene when Germany finally surrendered in May 1945. He was awarded a Silver Star for valor, but never bragged on it. He went straight to New York City when it was over. His generation's victory dance was to get straight to work in the economic bonanza just revving up. Because the war had happened elsewhere and all our stuff was intact, ready to restart, to make and sell anything under the sun to the shattered rest of the world and lend them money to buy it. Quite an opportunity for young men highly disciplined and regimented from their recent travails of war. My stepfather became a classic madman, as in the TV series, working in media, publishing, and PR, a hard-drinking cohort of mostly military vets who would knock down 3 martinis over lunch with clients, a nearly inconceivable feat, actually, when you think about it. But that showed what the war had done to the soldiers who survived. He died from it at barely 60 and from smoking 2 packs of Camel Straights a day, another habit of battle. We boomer boys had his war as movies and comic books. Sergeant Rock and John Wayne on the beach at Iwo. We had all the fruits of that post-war bonanza. We had Disneyland, the 1964 World's Fair, the Carousel of Progress, and Rock Around the Clock. We eventually had a war of our own, Vietnam, but it was optional for college kids. I declined to go get my ass shot off, of course. You have no idea what a fantastic bacchanal college was in the 1960s. Let the sunshine in. The great anti-war protests gave us a chance to pretend we were serious, but believe me, it was much more about finding someone to hook up with at the teach-ins and the street marches. The birth control pill was a fabulous novelty. We ignored the side effects, especially the social side effects that led later on to an epidemic of divorces and broken families. When you are a young man, sex is at least half of what you think of minute by minute. I was on a campus where all you saw were waves of nubile, joggling breasts coming at you beneath those sheer peasant blouses, which you understand suggests that the women were in on it too, being every bit as incited by their own frisky hormones. Personally, I was not altogether on board with the hippie program, though I let my hair grow. A lot about it gave me the creeps, the lurid posters of Hindu gods with elephant heads, the dumbass "hey man" lingo, the neurotic sharing of everything from clothing to money, the woolly armpits, the ghastly organic cuisine. I mostly eschewed drugs, never dropped acid, and smoked pot infrequently due to a chastening episode of frightening paranoia early on. Anyway, after Charlie Manson's caper, the whole thing lost its luster, and by the early 1970s, there wasn't much left but sideburns. And by then, many of us were in office of some kind, which is probably where things really went off the rails. The boomers should never have been allowed in those offices, especially the ones within 10 miles of Wall Street. That's where the cleverest among us came up with the signal innovations that have now wrecked the world. The coronavirus is a very bad thing for sure, but it's really nothing compared to the deliberate wickedness that engineered the so-called financialized economy, a supernatural matrix of something for nothing swindles and frauds that purported to replace actual work that produced things of value. The great lesson of the age was lost. The virtual is not a substitute for the authentic. And now the boomer geniuses of finance are scrambling frantically to hurl imaginary money into the black hole they have opened with their own reckless wizardry. But black holes are nothing like ordinary holes. They are unfillable. They just suck everything into a cosmic vacuum that resembles something like death, which in its implacable mystery may be just a door to a new disposition of things, the next life, the next reality. Of course, not all of us boomers worked on Wall Street or in its annexes, but we did more or less go along with all that wickedness because we never really made any earnest effort to stop it. The Dodd-Frank bill, don't make me laugh. Maybe it's just impossible to apologize for the mess we left behind after the party we enjoyed. I'm not a Christian in any formal sense, but perhaps only that kind of fathomless, unconditional forgiveness might avail. I am sincerely sorry. It's funny he talks about organic cuisine. A woman who was one of my bosses at UBC had been, she attended the school in the late 1960s. And in the spirit of the day, the cafeteria in the Buchanan building had been given over to the students. And so one day, one of these bright sparks thought, seaweed. There's all this seaweed, just a few hundred yards away from us, and it goes to waste. We should, gather the seaweed and cook it. And so they got a big cauldron and they put all the seaweed in the water and boiled it. And the stink was so horrendous, they had to evacuate the whole building. What do we hear from Malaysia? Don't nag your husband during lockdown, Malaysia's government advises women. There was the Insurance Corporation of British Columbia has a government monopoly over basic insurance in my province. And they run these anti-drinking and driving ads. And there was one about 15 years ago, which was just absolutely hilarious. There's this guy who's clearly drunk. And he gets into the car behind the wheel, and his wife or girlfriend is saying, don't do this, you're not fit to drive, etc., etc. Okay, then don't get in the car, lady. Anyway, she gets in the car, and she doesn't stop nagging him. It just keeps coming and coming, and I'm thinking, that's quite possibly the stupidest thing ever. The man is already drunk behind the wheel, but let's get him furious as well as that. And so she just keeps up, and he gets madder and madder, and finally he's turning his head, and he's not looking at the road, and blammo. But Malaysia, according to NPR, has the largest number of COVID-19 cases in Southeast Asia, with more than 2,900 and counting. 2,900, wow. This week, Malaysia's government also had a serious public relations issue after an ill-conceived plan went online. Malaysia's Ministry for Women, Family and Community Development issued a series of online posters on Facebook and Instagram with the hashtag Women Prevent COVID-19. It advised the nation's women to help with the country's partial lockdown by not nagging their husbands. The ministry also advised women to refrain from being sarcastic if they asked for help with household chores, and it urged women working from home to dress up and wear makeup. It is extremely condescending to both women and men, said Nisha Sabanayagam, a manager at the advocacy group All Women's Action Society. These posters promote the concept of gender equality and perpetuate the concept of patriarchy. The posters drew swift ridicule online. How did we go from preventing baby dumping, fighting domestic violence, to some variant of the obedient wives club, said Yin Xiaolong. I don't know, strikes me as being pretty good advice. Now, there's a story from Bureau Hedge, and I'm wondering, is this a hoax? Get paid $1,200 to watch the 12 best prepper movies as you self-quarantine to avoid COVID-19. Maybe you've got the Wuhan coronavirus. Maybe you're just afraid of getting it. Either way, staying at home and self-quarantine doesn't mean you can't have a good time or make money. Really? Okay. Who we're looking for? Someone passionate about both prepping and disaster movies who has time on their hands to watch some of our favorite prepper films. The job role is simple. Watch 10 movies, one miniseries, and one television show episode within 30 days and answer a few questions along the way. You'll receive a small worksheet to complete. The ideal applicant is passionate about prepping, would watch all of these movies for free, pays close attention to everything they watch and read, can binge watch all 12 of these in a short period, 30 days. To apply, you must be over 18, a U.S. citizen. Boo. So the movies, The Road, which is based on the Cormac McCarthy novel. I saw The Road in a theater when it came out, and I thought, is this the most depressing movie ever made? I think it is. After I joked on Twitter today that after I saw the movie, I had to restrain myself from offing myself in so that the chuds wouldn't get me. Other movies, 10 Cloverfield Lane. I haven't seen this. Chernobyl, the miniseries, haven't seen it. Captain Fantastic. Mad Max, I have seen that. Very enjoyable. Although in the American version of the film, they dubbed over Mel Gibson. A Quiet Place, I haven't seen that. It seems rather silly. The Black Mirror episode Metalhead, Children of Men, 28 Days Later, which I have seen, which I found very enjoyable. Of course, that movie has a scene in it very similar to a scene in Vanilla Sky by Cameron Crowe. Yes, here I am out of the streets. Where did everybody go? That seems pretty relevant. The Book of Eli, which I haven't seen. Into the Wild, which I have seen, which is a very, very sad movie. Contagion, which is about SARS. I haven't seen that. You know, apparently at the research station, the Amundsen Scott research station at the South Pole, what is it on it's either a midsummer's night or midwinter's night. I think the day when the darkness starts setting in. Every year they watch two movies. And one of them is The Shining and the other one is The Thing. Just to get the people there in the mood for 6 months of darkness at the end of the world. So what's happening in Canada? Well, we have 12,519 cases and 187 deaths. Again, there are 38 million people in Canada. Ontario, which is Canada's largest province, 14 million people, it has 67 deaths. My province of British Columbia, 5.1 million, has 35 deaths. But of course, we have to be locked down totally. Ontario has become a police state under Premier Doug Ford, and all the lefties who previously hated his guts are congratulating him for turning Ontario into a police state, because eventually there will be another left-wing government in Ontario, and they're looking forward to their own police state. BC health officials announced 4 more COVID-19 deaths, 53 new cases. As you know, I live on an island, Vancouver Island, the 8th largest island in the world. And there are 74 cases and 2 deaths. 74 cases, 2 deaths, and the whole place is locked down. It's total madness. Ontario has been asked for its models. And unlike the federal government, the Ontario government has said, okay, yeah, here's our model. This is what we used for our prediction. What is the prediction? COVID-19 could kill 3,000 to 15,000 in the province and could last 2 years. Again, considering the size of Ontario, these are pitiful numbers and in no way justifies a totalitarian society. The economy is on life support. Canadians need help now. What's the hold up? Yeah, it's fairly easy to guess. Trump recommends face masks to stem COVID-19, though says he won't wear one. Well, it's very difficult to wear a medical face mask, if you're not a doctor or a nurse, without looking foolish. Does the virus live on my pet's fur? Your COVID-19 questions answered. I think they meant fur baby, actually. Alrighty, and another spat between the United States and Canada. Trudeau warns the U.S. over restricting the trade of essential goods into Canada. He's warning the U.S. What exactly is the threat there? Let's see. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau sent a warning to the Trump administration, this is from the Globe and Mail, to keep the Canada-US border open for the trade of essential goods after medical manufacturer 3M said it is being forced to stop exporting N95 face masks. At a news conference on Friday, Trudeau said that blocking trade to Canada could backfire and end up hurting Americans as much as it hurts anyone else. That is absolutely fatuous. The level of integration between our economies goes both ways across the border. We are receiving essential supplies from the United States, but the United States also receives essential supplies and products, and indeed healthcare professionals from Canada every single day. Trudeau and most of the pundits, and certainly most of the Canadians that I've seen on Twitter, seem to be mystified that in what is supposedly a life or death event, the United States government has decided to prioritize its own people. Why would anybody be surprised? 3M makes these masks, and 3M originally stood for Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, but they have largely outsourced their manufacturing to guess where? China. That's right. Yeah. The modeling 3,000 to 15,000 people, the ramifications of which could last up to 2 years. No, if they're talking about this shutdown can't last much longer than another month, because then the economy dies, and it cannot. Parts of the economy begin dying, and they cannot be resuscitated. It's that simple. That these are, again, 3,000 to 15,000 in the province of Ontario, Ontario's largest and most populous province. And I'm just going to check the numbers here. 14.7 million people is the population of Ontario. This is penny wise and pound foolish. I got into it with people yesterday on Twitter. This happens several times a year. That because I have been noted for taking issue with Jewish elite opinion, people jump to the conclusion that I'm a neo-Nazi or I have any kind of sympathy for neo-Nazism. Well, I don't. I have never indicated any such sympathy in anything that I have ever written. And, I have a long career. It goes back to the mid-1980s. I don't know why. I said when people are desperate to find friends or to find people who share their views. Nazism died in a bunker in 1945 in Berlin, and it is not coming back. Hitler was the greatest loser in political history. One of the strange things about Twitter is that you never know what you say on it that's going to be popular. I've often crafted little pensées, which I think are going to, people are just going to be, oh, yes, this is tremendous, and they just go nowhere, right? But it seems that whenever I write about modern architecture, I get a lot of responses. Ray Sawhill tweeted yesterday, 99% of architectural modernism is desecration and death. And he linked to a piece, Canada's Best Architecture of 2018, recognized by Canadian Architect magazine. And one of the examples is a structure, I would say, a building circa 1900, quite a handsome building. I suppose you could say that it's built in the gingerbread style. And glass boxes have been attached to it. And the effect is grotesque. I wrote, "It is one thing to build something hideous ex nihilo. It is quite another to take a handsome building and make it hideous after the fact. It's like slashing the Rugby Venus with a cleaver or throwing acid in the face of a beautiful woman." And I attached a picture of the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, which is Canada's most visited museum. And it is a very handsome structure, circa 1910. And it was decided that it had to be made bigger. And so they brought in Daniel Liebeskind to design this extension, which is called the Crystal. Some Chinese fellow paid for it. It's called the Michael Lee Chin Crystal. And it is if the original structure is being devoured by some sort of monster. It is absolutely hideous. You know, Lisa Rochon, wrote in the Globe and Mail at the time, 2007, she said, "It's hard, aggressive, and in your face. It cantilevers dangerously over the street, shifting the ground from under our feet. Do not expect shelter from the 139 million Michael Lee Chin crystalline addition to Toronto's Royal Ontario Museum by Daniel Liebeskind. Expect the exaltation of one man, one architect, one individual. Expect the stuff of Liebeskind, an exile, a brilliant thinker, a marketer with a silver tongue." So people were asking me last night, well, there's no protest against this? Well, yes, there was furious protest against it. But running interference was this fellow, the CEO of the Royal Ontario Museum, William Thorsell. He'd been formerly editor of the Globe and Mail, a noted aesthete. William Thorsell, a passionate defender of architecture and public space, who insisted that something fantastic occur in an ancillary circulation space, can be thanked as much as Liebeskind, designer of the entire museum expansion in a joint venture with Bregman and Hammond Architects of Toronto. Also, because of Thorsell, the public square on Bloor Street has been cleared of the city's usual portfolio of junk. She writes that the new ROM rages at the world. This rage I cannot pretend to understand, but surely it has something to do with losing 85 of your relatives during the Holocaust, of playing the accordion, not the piano, because of what the neighbors in Lodz, Poland might say, of scribbling mad, inspired drawings in relative isolation, and Michigan's Cranbrook Academy of Art, of only knowing the pleasure of building at the age of 52. Liebeskind speaks often of all this. His architecture is in Facebook. When I first started studying Liebeskind, reading about him, I found out that he was born in Lodz, Poland in 1946, 1 year after the Second World War ended. Liebeskind has been quite vocal on what motivates his art. It's revenge. Yes, it is revenge. I've suffered, and now it's your turn. I'm going to talk now about Blaise Pascal's Pensées, and I'm using the Penguin edition, the latter-day Penguin edition, which is translated by A.J. Krailsheimer. The introduction is quite valuable, and he goes through the morass of Pensée studies. It is not a monograph. People say that it was supposed to be the basis of a book called An Apology for the Christian Religion, but there actually is no such title. That Pascal jotted down thoughts, and they're in some kind of order, but the order was largely wrecked after his death. when they were cut up and rearranged, and there's been various attempts to reconstruct Pascal's order, but it's rather like, Bruckner symphonies, that there are so many different versions of them. Bruckner he didn't have particularly high esteem, I suppose, and smarter people than him said, no, you have to rewrite this and you have to rewrite this. And we could have had many more symphonies from Bruckner if he had just, stuck to his guns. I have to say, though, that I was rather taken aback in the introduction by Krailsheimer's condescension towards Pascal. That, Pascal, when he writes of the Bible, that recent Bible studies or modern biblical scholarship, blah, blah, blah. Well, modern biblical scholarship is based on entirely on the notion that, of course, the Old Testament is just a bunch of Hebrew fairy tales. And the New Testament is propaganda, myth-making, written by early Christians a long time after Christ's death. And they speak of this thing called Q. And this comes up in Muriel Sparks' novel, Memento Mori, because I kept hearing about this manuscript called Q, which is supposedly, the real New Testament. Here's a passage from Memento Mori. And they tried to console her by telling her that Q was nothing really, not even a manuscript, which indeed it wasn't. And I must confess, I never understood how they could sit up so late fitting their ideas into this Q, which is nothing, really. So Blaise Pascal was born in 1623 and he died in 1662. For all of his denouncing of science in the Pensées, he was a scientist himself, quite a notable one. He constructed a calculating machine, which he started doing when he was a teenager. I mean, he was a genius, of course, and he was a physicist and geometrician, and he corresponded with other leading scientists of his day, including René Descartes. But we know him now primarily for the Provincial Letters, which is justifying what were called the Jansenists. I don't want to go into great length about the Jansenists. I'm not an expert in these matters, but the Jansenists, I suppose it was a flavor of Christianity that was associated with Pont Royal in France. And let's just say that it's rigorous. Jansenists were accused of being Calvinists, or essentially the same as Calvinists. That is not true. Of course, these days, and for some decades, whenever some traditionalist Catholic is being called out by a modernist, there will almost certainly be the charge that so-and-so is a Jansenist. Pascal and the Jansenists raged against the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, which was formed in 1540 by Saint Ignatius of Loyola. And the Jesuits were rather the shock troops of the Counter-Reformation. Many of the early Jesuits, particularly in the 16th century, were martyrs. And you have the Jesuit martyrs of Canada, Jean de Brébeuf and others. You have the 40 martyrs of England and Wales. The Jesuits were all highly educated men, and the Jesuits helped to bring about a revolution in the priesthood. Before the Counter-Reformation, standards for priests were quite lax, and this changed during the Reformation, and the Jesuits had a lot to do with it. But the Jesuits, particularly in France, took a great interest in politics, and they were seen as being seditious by many, and they were seen by many other Catholics as being, crypto heathens. And such was the clamor against the Jesuits that the order was suppressed in 1759. And it was restored by Pope Pius VII in 1814. Of course, these days, of course, the Jesuits are the, well, it's hard to say. I mean, you have the Dominicans, so many of these orders that they're not Catholic at all, really, as demonstrated by the first Jesuit ever to become a pope, anti-Pope Francis. But much of Blaise Pascal's thought and writing was devoted to his efforts against the Jesuits. Now, because of the nature of Pensées, it's the kind of book that one can dip into at any point. Just to give you a flavor of the book, he says that we are quite certain that we have not got a headache and are not limping, but we are not so sure we are making the right choice. Consequently, since the only thing that makes us sure is the evidence available to us, we hesitate and are taken aback when the evidence available to someone else makes him see just the opposite. All the more so when 1,000 other people scoff at our choice, because we are obliged to prefer our judgment to that of so many others, and that is a bold and difficult thing to do. There is never such a clash of views over a lame man. Man is so made that if he is told often enough that he is a fool, he believes it. By telling himself so often enough, he convinces himself, because when he is alone, he carries on an inner dialogue with himself, which it is important to keep under proper control. Evil communications corrupt good manners. We must keep silence as far as we can and only talk to ourselves about God, whom we know to be true, and thus convince ourselves that he is. So, Pascal has set himself the task of proving that Christianity was true and rational. And that he has much sport with experts in the Pensées, because experts are often proved to be wrong, and they are often in conflict with each other. I suppose if there was a class of people who all agreed on everything, then that would be more formidable. And of course, if the experts had an unbroken record of success in their nostrums and predictions, that would be another thing, but they don't. There's a French word, divertissement, which English form diversion. You see that word a lot in the Pensées. That Pascal makes much of boredom, how boredom is such an important motivator in human life. I think that my own view is that boredom is very much undervalued as a cause of our actions, particularly our political actions. As far as I can see, both in the United States and Canada, in the middle 1960s, it was decided to revolutionize both these countries through immigration because our leaders were bored, or perhaps they were merely spiteful, or under the control of what Edgar Allan Poe called the imp of the perverse. That boredom, Pascal says in the Pensées that our problem is that we cannot stand to be alone and quiet in a room, that we are constantly seeking diversion. And this search for diversion, it robs us of the great truth about life, that the only thing that we know to be true, that our life ends with death. And so we are not happy with the present, Pascal says. And this part of his argument was particularly appealing to me because, I had written about this with regard to Henri Bergson and his philosophy of flux, that this is the way that we pretty much all are now. We are always becoming, but never being. And a person who is becoming and never being is never going to be happy, never going to be satisfied, is always going to be rushing wildly about, searching for the latest diversion. Even people who have not read the Pensées likely have heard of the idea of Pascal's wager. Now, Pascal was a scientist. He writes, God is or God is not. Reason cannot decide between the two alternatives. Yes, Pascal hammers home in Pensées of the limits of reason. And of course, if God exists, God is something which cannot be understood by us. Tom Wolfe used the example of the dog, that if you look at the differences between the reasoning of a dog and a man, well, a dog can understand about 50 things, and most of them are quite simple. In fact, the reason why dogs make such a fuss when their owner returns to their house, or even when he sees him outside, is because the dog is not even intelligent enough to understand that, okay, the man has left, but he will come back. That's how dim-witted they are. But Tom Wolfe said, if God exists, then his relationship to us would be like that of the relationship of man to dog. And of course, faith is, the belief in God is the result of faith. So a game is being played where heads or tails will turn up. You must wager. It is not optional. Let us weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God is. Let us estimate those two chances. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager then without hesitation that he is. There is here an infinity of an infinitely happy life to gain, a chance of gain against a finite number of chances or loss, and what you stake is finite. And so our proposition is of infinite force when there is in the finite stake in the game, when there are equal risks of gain and loss and the infinite to gain. But some cannot believe. They should then at least learn your inability to believe and endeavor then to convince themselves. It was Pascal's belief. He was arguing against a lack of rigor in religion. It was his belief that a Christian society is good not simply because of the prospect of eternal life, but it is good for society as a whole because Christians will act in such a way as or more likely to act in such a way as in consideration of society as a whole. That is to say that Christians were better citizens. That the idea of the wager, it is an aid to faith. It's a well-known phenomenon that there are many people who pray and they get nothing out of it. But that does not mean that the prayer is wasted. That we're all given enough grace for our salvation. But there are many people who go through these bleak periods. But the prayer is valuable nonetheless. So science, that Pascal was a scientist, but he had grave difficulties with it because of its attempt to, particularly, from the time of René Descartes, to replace God. And there is, how can you be alive today at this time of the coronavirus when churches all over the world have been shut? And the Catholic Church deciding to shut all its churches even before it was ordered to suspend all the sacraments when, what does Dr. Anthony Fauci have to say? Because, he is the high priest of the cult of science. The science has replaced God. There's no question about it. Pascal writes, vanity of science. Knowledge of physical science will not console me for ignorance of morality in time of affliction, but knowledge of morality will always console me for ignorance of physical science. That he says, he talks about how clothes make the man. And this is very revealing. That he talks about the dress of men of authority, that they need this in order to persuade people that they should be obeyed. He says, our magistrates have shown themselves well aware of this mystery. Their red robes, the ermine in which they swaddle themselves like furry cats, the law courts where they sit in judgment, the fleur-de-lis, all this august panoply was very necessary. If physicians did not have long gowns and mules, if learned doctors did not wear square caps and robes 4 times too large, they would never have deceived the world, which finds such authentic display irresistible. If they possessed true justice, and if physicians possessed the true art of healing, they would not need square caps. The majesty of such sciences would command respect in itself. But as they only possess imaginary science, they have to resort to these vain devices in order to strike the imagination, which is their real concern. And this, in fact, is how they win respect. And of course, I have to point out here that it's only in the 20th century that doctors were actually in the business of saving people rather than killing people or tormenting them needlessly. I mentioned the treatment of syphilis a couple of weeks ago. Until penicillin, it was treated with mercury. And mercury is a deadly toxin. And there are some people who believe that the characteristics of syphilis, the terrible pain, the blindness, tertiary syphilis, the dementia, was actually caused by the treatment and not the disease itself. He writes, soldiers are the only ones who do not disguise themselves in this way because their role is really more essential. They establish themselves by force, the others by masquerade. This is why our kings have not attempted to disguise themselves. They have not dressed up in extraordinary clothes to show what they are, but they themselves are escorted by guards, scarred veterans. These armed troops whose hands and strength are theirs alone, the drums and trumpets that march before them, and these legions which surround them, make the most resolute tremble. They do not wear the trappings, they simply have the power. It would take reason at its most refined to see the Grand Turk surrounded in his superb seraglio by 40,000 Janissaries as a man like any other. You know, think about this. Think about how generals look now. I was really taken aback, during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, when the top, American generals would show up before Congress or whatever, and you just see this amazing fruit salad on their chests. And what is this? We're looking at another Alvin York or Audie Murphy. They award themselves all these medals basically now for showing up. And all of the braid that they have and all the rest of it, which, if Pascal is correct, it demonstrates that they are no longer serious, that they are no longer fit for purpose. I've often heard, well, it's still a common complaint, nurses, the nursing profession is well paid now, unlike in the past, but nurses complain of a lack of respect. Well, you see the same thing with teachers. That teachers basically traded respect for money. But with nurses, they did something else. Nurses used to wear white. They used to wear a white starched cap. They used to wear a white shirt and white skirts and white pumps or flat shoes. And this was a uniform, like a military uniform, and it commanded respect. Now they're all wearing purple or green pajamas, and they look like teenagers having a sleep over. I would say, if Pascal is correct in this, and I think that he is, if nurses were looking for greater respect, then they would go back to their old uniforms. So, as I say, this is not a monograph. It is a collection of thoughts that Pascal had. He writes about diversity. Theology is a science, but at the same time, how many sciences? A man is a substance, but if you dissect him, what is he? Head, heart, stomach, veins, each vein, each bit of blood, each humor of blood. A town or a landscape from far off is a town and a landscape, but as one approaches, it becomes houses, trees, tiles, leaves, grass, ants' legs, and so on ad infinitum. All that is comprehended in the world landscape. Pascal was a man who thought deeply about a great many subjects, and this made him unlike the vast majority of men. Most men, even those who are claimed as deep thinkers, never really give much deep thought to the basic conditions of the world, and Pascal did. And so I highly recommend his Pensées, but I would suggest that perhaps it is a book that one should read 2 or 3 pages a day, because there is so much density of thought, there is so much insight in this book that if you were to read it quickly, you would lose out. So this is a book which was written hundreds of years ago, which is still read avidly today. Survival is not the sole test of greatness, but the fact that the Pensées are still read today. I don't know how many people read Descartes these days. Again, it is highly recommended. It is a very profound work, and it is not a book which I think is restricted to Christians. So those are my thoughts on Blaise Pascal and his Pensées. And I have to say that Crailsheimer's translation is quite good. And as he explains, he sought a literal translation in that Pascal often uses the same word over and over and over again for effect, and other translators have decided to opt for variety. And so they seek synonyms. And I think Crailsheimer has made the right decision. So let's go to the chat to wrap up the show. The old nurse cap's denoted rank, said Choginkin 666. It's funny that this whole sexy nurse meme, they are not dressing up in the pajamas, in the purple or green pajamas. No, they are dressing up as the nurses used to be. Half Galician says they want nurses to look more like doctors with scrubs because nurses are cheaper to employ than doctors. Chogokin 666 says, yep, and all the minor medical staff wear stethoscopes around their necks like they're diagnosing patients. Yes, there was this motto associated with nurses that I first heard, in the 70s, that people talk about the doctors, but it's really the nurses that keep you alive. And I thought, what are they suggesting here? That if they don't like the cut of your jib, they will kill you? Lex Broken says you can't tell the nurse doctor from the janitor now. Well, I had an operation at one of Victoria's 2 major hospitals a few years ago. 3 years ago? Something like that. And I was shocked by the number of nurses in the hospital who had tattoos, like sleeve tattoos and the like. I never would have expected that. Never at all. Lecomte de Boreas says the most interesting thing about Pascal is that he never attended any school or university. He was educated with his father. Yes, You see, the old scientists were gentlemen practitioners, and they owed no loyalty to government. That scientists now are essentially civil servants. And when you see this, when you see them marching in lockstep, the reason for this is because if they express a dissenting opinion, then their research grants will end. So that is the show for today. Now, next week, what's going to happen next week? Well, I have to be out of here by the 6th, so this might be the last broadcast for a while. I will certainly start broadcasting again as soon as that becomes physically possible. That is my promise to you. Let's see what's coming up. On Theater Thursday, assuming there's Theater Thursday, I'm going to talk about a movie which is relevant to Holy Week. It's a true story of a group of Algerian monks called Of Gods and Men, directed by Xavier Beauvoir. On April the 16th, a beautiful modern horror story called Let Me In by Matt Reeves. On April 23rd, Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter, which is a remarkably prescient work. In effect, he pretty much invented social media in 1957, and he invented the cult of celebrity. Tashlin was a great artist, and this is a very, very funny and profound film. And April the 30th, one of my very favorite films, it's by Michel Gondry, and it's called The Science of Sleep. Coming up on the book club, April the 10th, another book which is appropriate to Holy Week, Evelyn Waugh's biography of Edmund Campion. On April 17th, Walker Percy's Lost in the Cosmos, which he describes as the last self-help book you will ever need. On April the 24th, a book about the financialization of the economy, Goliath by Matthew Stoller. And on May the 1st, Woody Allen's autobiography, Apropos of Nothing. I want to thank you all most sincerely for tuning in. If you like the show or any part of it, I would greatly appreciate it if you would click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you would like to donate to the broadcast, my PayPal address is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. I will be back on YouTube as soon as it is possible. Thank you so very much, and I hope that you all have pleasant weekends. And again, I hope that you are all able to fight the scourge of loneliness. Goodbye for now.